And welcome to tonight's edition of the Sunday Night SitDown. We have a very special edition to kick off the 2022 season. We are joined by congressional candidate Jerry Dickinson, and we're very, very excited to have him on as we prepare for a very vigorous midterm election year. We have numerous offices throughout the state that are up for election from governor to lieutenant governor to U.S. Senate to congressional elections to state Senate, all the way to the state house. And throughout the winter and spring season, we're going to bring a whole variety of those candidates on during the Sunday Night Sit Down series. This is going to be a special series this year for candidates to have an intimate conversation, a little bit different than a candidate forum format, where we can learn more about the candidates and get a perspective of why they are running for the offices they're running for. So to kick off our new season of the Sunday Night Sit Down, we have a law professor from the University of Pittsburgh and candidate for the United States Congress here in Pittsburgh, Jerry Dickinson. Welcome to the Sunday Night Sit Down.
For having me. I appreciate it, and looking forward to having the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit about, why you're running? Obviously, you ran in the last cycle. You decided to run again. Tell us a little bit about that process. What you learned from your last campaign, and why you decided to throw your hat back in the ring, which I know was not an easy decision.
Yeah. Well, I never really thought about getting involved in politics till a number of years ago, and I think a lot of it deals with first just my upbringing, where I come from. Both my biological parents weren't able to take care of me. I got placed in the foster care system. I ended up growing up in a large foster home with 11 kids altogether, multiracial, white kids and black kids, and we all came from broken homes and tragic circumstances. And we dealt with a lot of issues, trauma and addiction and poverty and incarceration, and a lot of things that Americans are dealing with. So I come with that worldview, and I think internalized empathy for those who are struggling. That's number one. And then number two, I think getting involved in politics, become a father. I think fatherhood 3 years ago, when my first daughter, Aria, was born, was a big part of it. All of a sudden, your world turns upside down, and you're looking at the future, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, what this world's going to look like, what Pittsburgh's going to look like, and how that's going to have impact on my two daughters. And that was a big part of deciding to get involved in politics and make a difference. And I did it. And so, as you mentioned, I ran in 2020 against a longtime incumbent, Mike Doyle. Given the circumstances of a pandemic, we took almost 35% of the vote and 40% in the city of Pittsburgh. So we did quite well, didn't get over the finish line, and we learned a lot. I was in all the nooks and crannies of the region, every single neighborhood in Pittsburgh before the pandemic hit. We were sidelined once the pandemic hit. We couldn't get out and do anything. But I learned a lot. We met a lot of people, heard about their concerns. One of the things that I like to do is I like to listen, just because of where I grew up in foster home with a lot of kids, and being a law professor and a teacher. I like to listen to people and hear what their concerns are. And by going through that process, we learned a lot about what people were really concerned about and what they want in their representatives. And that was a big boost to us. So, we learned our lessons, and we're back at it again here to hopefully win it this time around. So,
thank you so much for that. There's been a big discussion on the national level about voting rights. From your platform's perspective, how important are voting rights, and how, will you make voting rights a priority, if you are elected to be our next Congress member?
Yeah, voting rights is one of the top priorities right now, and in large part, look, we're still dealing with the aftermath of the insurrection of 2021, January 6th, and that was devastating to our democracy. But the entire 2020 election was devastating. The attempts to overturn the election, the attempts to throw out votes by many states, Republican states for the most part. And now, since that happened, since Biden took office, we've seen a wave of anti-democratic policies and laws being implemented by dozens of states, many of them Republican, to disenfranchise Black and brown communities from voting. And we're heading towards a situation where we may see a party, the Republican Party, attempt to try to overturn the 2024 election. So voting rights is imperative. And so when I'm in Congress as a constitutional law professor, I teach a lot about this issue of voting rights. We're going to have to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act immediately, as soon as possible. We got to impose pre-clearance requirements on those states, many of them southern states, that are enacting laws to disenfranchise voters, right? That's one. We need a federal oversight of the states. We also need to pass the Freedom to Vote Act. And the Freedom to Vote Act is going to be extremely important because it's going to outlaw partisan gerrymandering. So you see all the gerrymandering happening in Pennsylvania right now, and Texas and all these other states. We shouldn't have to deal with that. Congress should be able to oversee that process and ensure that we don't have gerrymandering. Make election day a holiday. It's easy as that, so people can go out to vote. Automatic universal registration, all these things. I mean, that's all stuff that has to be implemented. I'm looking forward to getting in Congress and being a part and leading that charge when I'm there, using my skill sets as a con law professor and my desire to want to keep democracy intact. So,
And you also spent a lot of your career focusing on housing from a legal perspective. At the federal level, what kind of legislations, kinds of things can be done at the federal level to make housing more affordable? As we know, here locally in the greater Pittsburgh area, it has become a greater concern over the last decade or so.
Yep. As a civil rights lawyer, I have been representing tenants for almost 10 years now in places like South Africa, in Pittsburgh, mostly poor tenants who don't have legal representation, and keeping them in their homes. I've conducted fair housing work on behalf of the disabled and elderly here in Pittsburgh, winning cases and settlements for them, doing community land trusts in predominantly Black neighborhoods, using my legal skills to actually create these affordable housing opportunities for first-time homeowners. So I've done a lot of this work, as you just mentioned. At the federal level, there's a lot that can be done. We have a housing crisis right now in this country, as we know. Affordability is a major problem. So what Congress can do? Well, Congress could implement a nationwide rent control, which amidst the pandemic, having the ability to have some states and localities required to impose rent control so that we don't have rising prices and we evict tenants who can't keep up with rent, that's really important. The other thing I want to do when I get into Congress is to implement a pilot project for a right to counsel. I want to ensure that tenants have a right to and access to a lawyer so that they are able to be represented in court. 90% of the time, if a tenant has a lawyer alongside them, they are far more successful. Okay, so I want to be able to implement a program that would actually bring that to Pennsylvania and to other states as well. The other one is, I think we're going to need renter refundable tax credits. Look, homeowners get subsidies at the end of the year on their tax rebates and their tax and their tax returns. There's no reason why renters shouldn't also benefit from that. So if you're spending 25% of your annual income on rent, then you should get something back at the end of the year on your tax returns. And that's going to help to minimize and decrease poverty and a number of other issues. I could go on and on about this, but these are just policies from the federal level that could be implemented to help the gentrification and affordability problem that we're dealing with. And then lastly, I think HUD, through the Housing and Urban Development, through Congress, we can bring more resources into Pittsburgh to subsidize new development so that we can have 30 or 40% below market rental units so that we can ensure that we're not displacing our communities, which we're seeing it happen here in Pittsburgh at a rate that is really, really concerning. So, housing is a big issue, and I'm certainly looking forward to fighting that fight in the halls of Congress.
Sure. And can you talk just a little bit about, being a professor of constitutional law, being a civil rights attorney? You talk about how those experiences, shape you and how they would be an asset, if you were elected to Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I come to Congress, I think, with a significant amount of knowledge and experience and understanding of how Congress works, because I'm a constitutional law professor. I've been studying this for a long time. I've been engaging this type of work for a long time. In fact, I know more about Congress than most candidates in this race, almost all of them, just based off of my experience as a constitutional law professor. You take that experience to Congress, and now you know how the process works. You know how Congress goes about its voting processes. You know how the executive branch and the president, what powers they have. You know how the federal judiciary works in the Supreme Court. All those things are going to be really important. And we've seen through impeachment processes, we've seen through a number of major constitutional crises that lawyers and constitutional law professors who are in Congress are the ones leading the charge and actually doing a lot of the work. And as someone who's actually done the work as a civil rights lawyer as well, I think that you're going to bring a lot of that experience and knowledge to the playing field. And I think on top of that, being a civil rights lawyer and actually having worked with people who are affected, their rights have been violated, actually working alongside them, you take that experience to Congress and you can say to folks, look, this is how our system is affecting the poor in this country. This is how our system is actually causing more racial inequities as a result of laws that have been implemented. You have that knowledge and background, you're ahead of the game, you're able to make change on a level that I think some other congresspersons aren't able to do. So.
And you talked a little bit about constitutional crises. Now, this hasn't, been an issue that's been on the forefront of people's minds locally. We've been dealing with, inflation and the pandemic and things like that. But this has been more part of the national conversation. How many people have said, people like constitutional law professors that serve in Congress, like Jamie Raskin of Maryland, just, released a book where he talked about how dangerously close we came, to a true, constitutional crisis. Can you talk a little bit about, in the events of 2020 into 2021, and the insurrection, how in peril, is, our democracy and the constitutional system that we know it to be right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are as close as we're going to get to slipping into an undemocratic, authoritarian nation. We've never gotten this close before. And the reason why is because we have one party, the Republican Party, that is engaging in a concerted effort to delegitimize democratic processes and elections. In other words, they care about power and they do not care about the people. They care about power over democracy. And that's extremely dangerous, because the end result is either that party unfolds and dissolves itself, or it actually ends up holding on to power and ending democracy. So we're very close. We're going to need people in Congress who understand that fight and are going to be willing to take it to the House floor. And we're going to deal with more constitutional crises. Like I said, 2024, we're going to be facing a situation where we might have Republican states that attempt to overturn an election. And we have members of Congress who may end up trying to do that as well, simply because they have this big lie about fraud, about election fraud, about the election being stolen. And what Donald Trump started 2 years ago or a year ago, that same message is still resonating with people across the United States, that somehow the election was stolen. And that's just not true. And once you say it over and over and over again, people start to believe it. And it's harder to kind of reverse course at that point. So we got a lot of work to do to fix some of our systems and our constitutional provisions to ensure that that happens. And I'm looking forward to doing that when I'm in Congress. So.
Thank you. And in your last campaign and, during your current campaign, you've been very clear that you're running, from the progressive wing of the party. And over the last year, we've seen that that it's been a challenge, to pass some of the progressive promises that were made by, the Biden, Harris ticket. And there's frustration on all sides, but particularly within the progressive caucus, of the Congress. If elected to Congress, what will you do to, try to manage the expectations that you progressives in the Pittsburgh area may have for certain, policies to be passed, the frustration around Build Back Better, the frustration around the voting rights. And obviously, a lot of that has been stonewalled, within the Senate. It has passed the House, but the frustration is there nonetheless. How will you balance being a staunch advocate for progressive values while also managing expectations that you'll be one of 435, not including 100 other senators that will also have a say in the matter?
Yeah. Um, Look, change, here in the United States, we've seen this over and over again throughout history, that change can be slow. And that's in large part because of the way our government is structured. To pass a law, you've got to get through the House and then the Senate, and then the president's got to sign it. The president doesn't sign it, then, Congress can attempt to try and overturn that veto by a 2/3 majority vote. But that's all very difficult, right? So we know that. But now, even more so, we've got gridlock in Congress. Republicans are going to say no to everything the Democrats say. So it doesn't even matter. You can't even get Republicans on board with anything. Now it's becoming an ideological battle between the two parties. And I think it's a dangerous situation for us to be in right now. I am a progressive, but I'm not overtly ideological in that sense. A lot of the issues that I really do care about come out of personal experience, whether it be dealing with poverty or the criminal justice system, incarceration, and being inside prison walls with my family members, dealing with addiction with family members, and trauma and mental health issues. And a lot of these things that are happening, affordable housing and evictions, these are all things or experiences that me and my family have dealt with over the years. And that's what drives me to want to make change on a lot of these issues. It's not necessarily just an ideological agenda. And I think if we understand it as not just an ideological agenda, but that these are practical issues that are affecting people's lives every day, and these are issues that some congresspersons or future congresspersons have experienced themselves, then I think we can help to legislate better by telling stories about why this is so important. I think the Democratic Party, we've lost sight of the ability to tell stories and about how these issues actually tangibly affect the lives of others. We've lost sight of that, and I think some of that comes out of the close attention to just ideology. But at the end of the day, these are issues that affect real people, and we've got to be able to present these policies, ideas in that fashion. And so when I'm in Congress, I think, one thing I think is going to be very important is being able to listen to people. As I said before, I'm a big listener, and understanding that the way that I view the world may not, and also addressing some of these problems may not be exactly the right way to do it. I need to listen to the constituents and understand what are their concerns and needs, and then take that to Congress and be able to make change. There are going to be moments when you have to push back. No doubt about it, even within your own party and against the Republican Party, and stand on principle, no doubt about it. But, I'm a bridge builder, a consensus builder. And so I want to be able to do that when I'm in Congress and bring different wings of the Democratic Party together to be able to get things done. And the reality of it is, if you don't deliver, right, as a politician, as a representative, as a party, if you don't deliver, then, constituents and voters are going to say, what are you doing? What's wrong? What's going on? And that's, for me, the biggest part of it is, can we get these progressive policies done? And knowing and understanding how the Constitution works, how Congress works, I think is going to be a huge asset and benefit for me going into Congress to make change. So.
And keeping with the theme of current events, again, with your experience as constitutional law professor, have you been following the investigation with the January 6th committee, and what that has come out of that at this point? Do you think is something that we really need to be talking about more publicly, and what has stood out the most about of all the events that have happened that we need to really start putting to the front of our minds and paying attention to, like we're paying attention to inflation and gas prices and things like that?
Well, for the January 6th investigation right now, one, I'm happy that Congress is taking the step to do this. That's really important. I see it two ways. One, you've got to have the investigation done by Congress. That's their duty. They have a constitutional duty to do this. On the other end, you have the Department of Justice and Merrick Garland, Attorney General, who also needs to step up to the plate and become far more aggressive in prosecuting those who have actually engaged in misconduct and lies and a scheme to attempt to overturn our government. I mean, that's really what we're dealing with. And so I think the biggest surprise to me, which shouldn't be that much of a surprise, is just the web of connections that lead to Donald Trump. I mean, that when you see the details and the facts come out and you realize how many players who were under and working under the president at the time knew about what the president was trying to do, understood that this was coming, and didn't do anything about it. Why? Because they didn't want to upset the president. I think that's really, it's scary. It's disconcerting, because this is a man who may end up running for president again in 2024. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that this was a scheme. This was a planned out operation on the part of the president to effectively overturn an election and start an insurrection. The other thing I would just say here is that with this January 6th committee and the investigation that's going on, we need to hold people accountable, and they have to be punished. And so that people realize that if you want to continue to try and to espouse white supremacy and to espouse white nationalism and try to overturn elections and try to start insurrections, there's going to be a major punishment. And we've seen it with some of the Pennsylvanians who were involved in that insurrection. They are in federal court and they are being prosecuted to the fullest extent. And I think that's what needs to happen. And I certainly look forward to being a part of the judiciary committees in the House of Representatives to be able to assist in that process, because this is going to be a long process of investigation. It's not going to end anytime soon. And the sooner we get to the bottom of it, better off we're going to be for this democracy. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Now, thank you for that. Yeah, I was saying that very recently you did an opinion piece talking about Pittsburgh being an apartheid city. You talk a little bit about what drove you to write that, and why you used such stark terms in your description, and as a candidate for Congress, what do you see as your position as a member of Congress to change that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. I had been thinking about that piece for a long time. It was published in February of 2021 in Public Source. Over 10 years ago, I was a Fulbright scholar to Johannesburg, South Africa, and I was doing human rights work. I was a human rights activist. I was working alongside South African lawyers. We were representing squatters in evictions. We were helping to organize and relocate after evictions. We were helping to assist with clean water litigation as well. So doing a lot of work in the inner city slums and shanty towns of South Africa. And I had realized during my time in South Africa that Johannesburg, even though we're in a post-apartheid era, it was still one of the most unequal societies in all the world, along health and income and occupation, education, some of the worst racial disparities in all the world. Fast forward 10 years later, and I'm now a law professor and a candidate for Congress in Pittsburgh, and I'm crisscrossing the entire region. And again, I'm seeing on foot, in person, the stark contrast. You have hypersegregation in Pittsburgh, one of the most segregated cities in all the United States. But then I also realized, amidst meeting with people and voters, that we have massive racial disparities, some of the worst in all the United States. And that brought me to the conclusion. I remember meeting with a voter in the Hill District, having a conversation about gentrification and housing. And it was that moment I said to myself, look, hypersegregation and racial disparities in Pittsburgh make it, an archetype of an American apartheid city, one of the worst. And some of those results and consequences aren't that far off from apartheid South Africa. And I made that connection, and I decided to write about it and to have an open dialogue. And I think, in moving forward with talking about racial justice and racial inequalities in Pittsburgh, the first move is that we have to acknowledge our history. We have to acknowledge the dark history of discrimination and segregation in Pittsburgh, the Hill District, Lower Hill District redevelopment being, completely wiped out, and thousands and thousands of Black Pittsburghers being placed into public housing projects and racial zoning and racial steering and a number of other mechanisms that segregated the city. We need to be open about that history. That history is part of who we are. And if we are able to acknowledge that history, that allows us then to move forward and say, what can we do now to fix some of the segregation problems and the racial disparities? How can we address them? A couple of things, as you mentioned, what would you do? What can you do in Congress? Well, one of the biggest problems with poverty in Pittsburgh, particularly in Black and brown communities, is lack of access to educational opportunities and job opportunities. We're going to have to bring more business opportunities for wealth building in our communities. That's going to be a major, major concern. Affordable housing. We have a displacement problem, which only creates more segregation. We've got to be able to keep people in their communities, have them have access to affordable housing as well. And then the other one here, which I think is a big issue in Pittsburgh, Black maternal health. It's an issue that's near and dear to my wife, me, my two daughters. I mean, statistically speaking, Black maternal health is going to be worse for Black women in Pittsburgh than anywhere else in the United States. And that's a problem. And we need to have Congress actually implement laws that force hospitals and medical centers to be held accountable for discrimination in treatment in